Hello, I'm Corinna Howard, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, and welcome to episode 79. I had so much fun on the tube last time when we went to Baker Street and talked about the Blackout Ripper. I didn't love the horrendous topic, but I love looking back at London's history. So we're back on the tube again. We're off to Balham in South London today, and this is on the Northern Line. I realise I often mention the tube lines involved, but one day I really want someone to visit London and listen to these episodes to match the places that they're visiting. So maybe I should be including some more actual, factual, tube-based information, as well as the murder and the hauntings and the weird goings-on. Everyone has their dream and the hope of some travel-based true crime geekery from people is mine. So do let me know if you visit London and you have a little listen to an episode about somewhere you're staying. Today we're off to Balham. Balham at the time that we're going to talk about wouldn't have counted as being in London. It would have been a suburb or a little town on its own. And today it's sort of very much part of South London, but in 1870s it was much more green fields, big houses, more space. And the mystery we're going to talk about today is frustratingly unsolved, but it's also incredibly difficult to get facts. It was completely dominating the media at the time. And so I've spent most of the weekend knee deep in old newspaper articles and people's opinions on what happened. And it is so difficult to fact check that I've gone with what seems to make logically the most sense to me, but also what appears most often. I read a very interesting article that I thought, oh, this has got everything I need to know in it. This has been really well researched. Could not find anything to back these theories up anywhere. And in fact, I found some stuff that pointed to it being a load of old tosh. So make of that what you will. Today we're going to talk about the Balham Mystery. Now, it's sometimes called the Balham poisoning. Either way, that's what we're talking about. Now, we're going to start in 1864 or 1867. That date is varied. Florence Campbell, the daughter of, well, it says an Australian magnate, but I believe he was an Englishman who had travelled to Australia, made his money in the gold mines, and then come back. And his daughter, Florence, is second of his 7 children and the apple of his eye, his favourite, rather spoilt. And she has this idyllic childhood, and she meets Captain Alexander Louis Ricardo, who is in the Grenadier Guards. He's dashing, but Florence does not fancy being an army wife. The Crimean War's just ended. She doesn't want to be dragged off somewhere hot and out of society. It's not the life for her. So she insists that he leaves the army. He resigns his commission when they marry. And this doesn't go well. Ricardo doesn't really know what else to do with himself. He is an army man through and through. He likes the structure of the army. He likes the army life. And he becomes what is described in the Wexford People as a debauchee, which I've never seen. He basically becomes an alcoholic. He's a violent alcoholic. They argue a lot. He's miserable. She's miserable. And one night he's so violent that she packs up and leaves. They separate. They separate because of his affairs, his violence. and it's alcoholism, but they do stay married. So they're just living in separate residences. And because of the time, this is not blamed on Ricardo. This is all Florence's fault. Florence should stay with her husband and just put up with his bad behaviour. So she is sort of disgraced in society and with her family. And to make matters worse, she starts an affair. She starts an affair with the much older Dr. James Manby Gully, who is a married, fashionable society doctor. And she, instead of going back to her husband, like her father tells her to do, she goes to Malvern to a spa to sort of recuperate and take some time away. And this spa is run by Dr. James Gully, who is, the bee's knees. He is the man who knows all about hydrotherapy, which was very big at the time. And they begin this affair. Now, he is obviously in love with Florence. She is disgraced, and he chooses to retire from medicine to move to London to be with Florence. He gives it all up, basically, to be with her. Now, some accounts have it that she got pregnant, and he operated on her to remove the baby, obviously saying to people that it was to remove a tumour. And she was really ill after this. It took her recovery was not easy. And while she's recovering, she is nursed by her loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Jane Cox, who we'll talk about later. So throughout all of this, Mrs. Jane Cox is her go-to woman. They'd met and really become best buds. And Florence was a very wealthy woman. Mrs. Cox was a widow with 3 children, and so she becomes technically a housekeeper, but she's basically like a live-in working bestie, from what I can tell. She's sort of a housekeeper crossed with companion, and they do everything together. Now, in 1871, they do everything together, and also she nurses her through her illness after the abortion, and she is probably Florence's confidant. She probably knows all there is to know about Florence. In 1871, at the age of 28, Captain Ricardo dies of alcoholism. Some sources have this. It's intriguing. They have it as him dying in suspicious circumstances, but from what I can tell, it's not suspicious at all. He just dies of alcoholism. And he leaves Florence a wealthy widow. She inherits £40,000, which is just over £900,000 in today's money. Some say that she had £3,000 a year. I can't do maths that well, but you get the idea. She's not only the daughter of a very rich man who has, although I think they've sort of disowned her, I don't think they have legally disowned her. I don't know if she's getting an allowance from him. I don't think that her family are likely to see her destitute, even if they are disapproving. But that is Florence. Now, Charles Bravo was born Charles Deloney Turner at St Pancras in London. He's baptised in Jersey in 1852, and he is the son of Augustus Charles Turner and Mary Turner. But that marriage does not end well, or his father dies, but I am assuming it doesn't end well because Charles would later take the surname of his stepfather, Joseph Bravo. So Charles is, by all accounts, of cheery and charming. He attends Trinity College, Oxford. He becomes a barrister. He's good at his job. He's respected and successful. He's on the up and up. Now, at some point, he sets up a residence in Maidenhead. And when you see this, it implies that basically he shacks up with a woman he's not going to marry and has a house that he can live in with her, but it's not in town. It's not somewhere where he's going to know people. And they have a child together, Katie. And by all accounts, he is good. I was about to say he's good to this daughter. Not good enough to actually marry her mother and be a father. But he loves this daughter and he does pay for her. In September 1875, he meets Florence and proposes by letter about 20 days later. So it's very quick. She accepts and they are married in November. Now, he's a barrister, he's charming, he is young, he is, on the up. And she has been exiled from society and from her family. So for her, she doesn't need security of money, but she's probably feeling incredibly isolated. Whereas he, by all accounts, likes money. And though his family are well off and he has a well-paid job, he has to ask for handouts from his family, which he hates. He wants his own money. So on paper, this is a sort of win-win situation. Now, Florence says that when she met Charles, she ended her affair with Dr. Gully, and Charles, for his part, gave up his home in Maidenhead. So they move to a house called the Priory in Balham, which is a striking Gothic villa in acres of parkland. And as I said, Balham wasn't a sort of considered an actual part of London at the time. It's very much on the outskirts, but it was becoming more popular with wealthy people who saw it sort of as a commutable distance from London, but you got more bang for your buck. You could have the sort of country life, but without being too far out in the country. So Florence actually lived in this house before she met Charles. When her first husband died, she moved to the Priory. We know that she was sort of a social exile, so she lives in this big, beautiful house. She has horses there. She has servants there. She can live in the way that she enjoys, but I suppose feel less of the pain of the London exile, basically. It's easier to quietly live your life how you want it without the feeling that you're going to bump into people you know who don't want to know you anymore. Interestingly, Dr. Gully buys a house just down the road, and he is a frequent visitor before they get married, before Florence marries Charles. And one version I saw said that Florence's solicitor had actually caught them in flagrante in the living room. It's probable that all the servants knew what was going on. She had separated from her husband before they were divorced. There's probably not a lot that the servants don't know about Florence. So she marries Charles. Charles moves in. Now, Charles's behaviour towards Florence was controlling, mean, violent, and bullying. This is denied by his family, who say that he was charming, but as we know, that has nothing to do with people being abusive. Now, Florence is wealthier than Charles and had sensibly opted from the start to hold on to her own money, which was an option only recently provided by the Married Women's Property Act of 1870. So recent, but this act meant that rather than before, when she married Charles, everything of hers would become her husband's. Can you imagine? It meant that she could hold on to her stuff if she wanted. And she did want. And it's believed that this led to tensions within their marriage. Many believed that Charles had married for money, and when he didn't get full access to it, he was furious. He was also very penny pinching without needing to be, which is one of my most disliked traits in someone, which is very specific and very weird, I know, but I'm not for throwing money about thoughtlessly, but unnecessary penny pinching to the detriment of others is disgusting. And as soon as Charles arrives, he sacks one of the coachmen, he sacks one of the undergardeners and a lady's maid, meaning that the housemaid, Marianne Keeber, who we will talk about later, had to take on the duties of the lady's maid. He sacked the undergardener for refusing to carry parcels, and he sacked a coachman. We'll talk about that later, for dangerous driving. But yeah, he just wanted to save money, even though it wasn't his money, and he was sacking people. Florence, for her part, seems to have taken to drinking a bit much. So it wasn't wedded bliss from the get-go. Now, in December 1875, now, for some people they say this is about 4 months into the marriage. Other people say they get married in November. It's very confusing. But about 4 months into the marriage, Charles and Florence have dinner. Apparently they had bloaters on toast, then lamb and vegetables. And after dinner, Charles goes into the morning room. Florence says she doesn't feel great. She goes upstairs to her room with Mrs. Cox. And the maid, Marianne Keeber, goes about her business. She had actually been with Florence since she was widowed. So she knows Florence very well. She knows the household very well. And she would say that Florence was under the effects of wine. But then Mrs. Cox sent down for some masala and water. And so Marianne goes to get that. Now, as she's walking through the hallway to take the wine upstairs, she said she saw Charles coming out of the morning room looking ghastly pale and white. He stares at her and then goes upstairs, first going into Florence's dressing room to tell her off in French about drinking too much. Speaking French so that the servants wouldn't be able to understand, although obviously somebody understood. And then he goes into his bedroom. Florence goes to bed and Keeber goes about her duties. She calls the dogs downstairs. But as she's doing this, Charles's bedroom door flies open and he calls Florence, Florence, hot water, hot water. Florence and Mrs. Cox, though Marianne would say they would have been able to hear because he shouted very loudly, they don't do anything. So Keeber runs to Mrs. Cox to say that Charles is ill. So the two women get to the bedroom and they find Charles standing by the open window, which he had been sick out of. Mrs. Cox runs to get water, hot water, and when she returns, Charles is sitting on the floor, semi-conscious, leaning against a chest of drawers. Keeber goes to wake up Florence and has to violently shake her awake. She's in such a deep sleep, which could be down to drink, and says that Charles is ill, and Florence goes to her husband's room where she now finds him completely unconscious. Now, the household, as soon as Mrs. Cox saw Charles, she had requested that the family doctor be called. Florence now says, we can't wait for the family doctor, get the closest doctor. So the doctors are called, they turn up, and all of them, there would be 5 in total, immediately suspect that he has taken some form of poison. Now, he regains consciousness and he denies this. He had been taking laudanum for his toothache and for neuralgia, but this is ruled out by the doctors. This is not the work of an overdose of laudanum. Laudanum is a tincture of opium, so it's more likely to cause drowsiness, anxiety, not excruciating stomach pain and vomiting that this seems to be causing. Now, he's seen, as I said, by 5 doctors, including Dr. William Gull, who some believe is Jack the Ripper. and he has time to be visited by his family. He's affectionate to his wife. They seem to be kind to each other, and he writes his will, and he leaves everything to Florence, and he asks her to be kind to his daughter Katie, and is fairly sort of aware that death is coming and there's not a lot he can do about it, but he doesn't seem curious as to what was happening to him. He's resigned to death. He doesn't seem to want to know how he's been poisoned or who has poisoned him. I suspect it's because he thinks that it's something to do with the laudanum, but I believe the doctor said it wasn't, and he doesn't seem that interested in what could it be. So Charles Bravo's death is not quick. It takes 3 days. It's extremely painful, but as I said, he maintains he's got no idea what he's taken right up until the end. He doesn't suspect anyone. He doesn't say he has any enemies. Afterwards, the doctors obviously need to find out what's going on. They take some samples of the vomit from outside the window and find it completely tainted with antimony. His post-mortem shows his organs to be completely saturated in the poison, and death was found to have been caused by ingestion of a large amount of tartar emetic, which is a mix designed as an emetic to be used in lots of ways. We'll get into that in a minute. One source says there were traces of it in his mouth, throat, and stomach, where it had burned through the tissue lining in his alimentary canal. The worst damage was in his intestines, which had been blistered and swollen. The large intestine, in fact, had been virtually disintegrated. So, pretty nasty way to go. They spoke to witnesses to find out what had happened. They obviously interviewed everyone in the household. Some people suggested that it was suicide, but a horrendous way to go. I don't think you would take an emetic voluntarily as a way to end your life, especially when we know he had access to laudanum, which, although can still obviously be unpleasant, I believe out of the two would be the nicer option. He was cheerful. He was in no way suicidal. He, for all his problems with Florence, he was married to the gift horse. There's no... He just, even though she maintained control of her money and her property by law, he was still her husband. He still had control over her to a certain extent, hence why he was firing people and being quite dominant about who worked at the house. So he was in a great position, even if he was frustrated about not having complete access to her wealth. So obviously no one else was affected who had been with him that evening. They looked at what he had eaten, what they'd all eaten for supper. One story bangs on about this bottle of Burgundy. Now, the butler had decanted a fresh bottle of Burgundy that evening. He had had about 3 glasses of it, and then the decanter with the remaining wine was put in the cellarette, which I love. It sounds like a 60s Pans people. So the cellarette in the dining room, so the little wine cupboard in the dining room. But from there, it had disappeared. Now, this obviously looks suspicious to some. It meant that the remaining wine wasn't available for testing, but also had it been removed for that very reason. But I think that is all nonsense. I believe that if this bottle, this decanter of Burgundy, had disappeared, it has just been drunk by somebody else in the house. Whether the butler thought he'd have the rest of it and nobody would really notice, or whether Florence thought she'd have the rest of it. Antimony doesn't taste of anything. So I think lots of people think, oh, it must have been in his wine because his wife and housekeeper were not drinking Burgundy. But it would have changed the colour, so it would have been very noticeable. It's also a very fast-acting poison. So had it been in the wine, it starts working within about 15 minutes. So he probably wouldn't have got to glass 2, let alone glass 3, without it being very obvious. Now, Charles also often drank from a bottle of water next to his bed. This was well known to the housekeeper and maids who filled it, but also his wife. It would make more sense for the poison to be administered that way. It would also give some distance for the poisoner, because obviously you don't know, you know that he'll drink it, but you don't necessarily know when. Also, if he has separate bedroom to his wife, he's going to drink it most probably when he's on his own, and therefore, no one else is there to be suspected. Interestingly, though, on the second inquest, one of the doctors swears that he has a drink of water from that bottle whilst he was there treating Charles. So we're still not ever sure of how it's administered. Antimony is a silver white, brittle, solid or dark grey powder. It's harmful, obviously, to the skin and eyes, but it can cause problems with the lungs, heart and stomach. And when ingested in fatal amounts, it resembles arsenic poisoning. Neither of these are pleasant. Your innards are basically, your digestive system is basically eroded. Your body processes chemicals differently, and antimony poisoning could be the result of prolonged taking of medicines containing it, such as tartar emetic, used to induce vomiting or treat fungal infections. This is a thing that happens a lot with prescription medications, more so in America, I would say, than here. And I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but only because we don't have... it's like pulling teeth getting prescriptions out of most doctors here, whereas the pharmaceutical companies like to make lots of money over in America. So many medicines work as building up in the system, rather than it being like paracetamol, for example, where you take it and 20 minutes later you feel the benefits, but then it will wear off. Here, with a lot of medications, it is a case of them building up and sitting in your system for a while, and lots of people don't realise that. So you get a lot of accidental overdoses. I always think of Tom Petty with this, where they just don't realise that although they took one medication, say 2 days ago, and they're taking another medication 2 days later, they think they should be clear. But in fact, those two can mix in the system and cause fatal results. So we know that he had taken tartar emetic. So whether he had taken too much of it over a long period of time. In the late 19th century, tartar emetic is sometimes used as a sort of aversion therapy for alcoholism, and wives would use it. Wives would use it for a couple of reasons. Wives would use it if their husbands were drinking too much. They would give them a bit of tartar emetic, which would make them very sick. And then if you're sick every time you drink, you don't want to drink so much. There are illegal operations you can get that basically have the same effect if you are an alcoholic and you want to give up drink. But some wives would give their husbands tartar emetic, very small amounts, to make them feel queasy and not in the mood for love. So if their husband had a higher libido than they did, or was into things that they weren't into, which we'll get into in a minute, a bit of tartar emetic is really going to knock that amorous urge on the head. The death of Charles Bravo was front page news. I can testify to this. Rarely have I done newspaper deep dives that have taken, I just stopped myself in the end, because there's just pages and pages and pages, and they all have different stories, and it is a really interesting case to research in terms of how the journalist's view of someone, or the journalist's opinion of someone, or how they look, can really taint the whole thing. We'll get onto that a bit later when we talk about Mrs. Cox. But the death is front page news. That it takes over everything else. It takes over politics, war, everything, and the lurid detail of the Bravos' past marriages and love affairs took precedence over Victorian prudishness, and his grisly death caused countrywide fascination. There would be 2 inquests. The first inquest is held at the Priory, but eventually this is deemed to have been a bit of a bit too nice. So, like something out of a crime novel. The second inquest calls the jury to convene at the billiard room of the nearby Bedford Hotel, where they would hear witness testimonies and the intimate minutiae of the Bravos' marriage, including how Charles subjected Florence to lurid sexual acts, which, again, we'll talk more about in a minute. Now, there are lots of different opinions on what could have happened. One hypothesis was that Charles Bravo had been slowly poisoning his wife with small cumulative doses of antimony in the form of tartar emetic. This could have been in the aim of killing her of killing her and therefore inheriting her wealth, or to prevent her alcoholism, which was taking hold. For some, they say that it would explain Florence's chronic illness that she had started displaying since just before their marriage. Although they were apparently having sex before marriage, they weren't living together, so it seems odd that he would be able to start poisoning her so early. But you can't rule that out. But actually, Florence suffered 2 miscarriages in the first part of their marriage, in the first 4 months of their marriage, and was really unwell especially after the second one. And for some, they maintain that she was terrified of getting pregnant again because she believed a third miscarriage would kill her. It's more likely that that's why she was unwell, rather than him immediately starting to poison her. She was wary about having children. He was keen to have children. So again, if you're trying to have a child with someone and you want to have the child and she is going to be carrying it, it seems odd to be poisoning her at the same time. Some people, so in this version, they believe that that evening that he is poisoned, he's treating himself with laudanum for his neuralgia and his toothache, but before going to bed, he mistakenly swallows the poison, the tartar emetic with which he has been poisoning his wife. Again, I think if you're a regular taker of laudanum, he's a clever man. You don't keep the poison with which you're poisoning your wife next to your own supply. You also don't keep the poison with which you're poisoning your wife as accessible. You have housekeepers, maids. It would be far too easy if something happened to Florence for someone to say, well, yeah, he kept the poison in his cupboard in his bedroom next to his laudanum. So I don't believe that version at all. So other investigators have offered different suggestions, including suicide, murder by Mrs. Cox, whom Bravo had threatened to sack, murder by Florence, murder by a disaffected coachman whom he'd fired. So yes, the 2 inquests were held. The first is in April at the Priory. The coroner thought it was suicide, and he was trying to keep scandal under wraps, and it's all a very nice thing. Florence provides refreshment. 2 of the 5 jurors said that Charles told them he rubbed laudanum into his gums, and he was worried that he'd accidentally swallowed some, but they obviously knew that this is not the same effects as antimony poisoning. And the inquest returns an open verdict. They say death by poison, but they don't know how it was administered or why. Whether it was an accident, whether it was suicide, whether it was misadventure. And I just want to talk a bit about Mrs. Cox. She's a very interesting character in all of this. Now, she had actually introduced Charles to Florence as she was acquainted with Charles's stepfather, and she was very close to Florence. She'd actually would sit and eat with the couple, drinking champagne and masala with Florence. At the dinner table on the night that Charles got poisoned, she would sit beside the bed knitting whilst Florence went to sleep. And some media reports had therefore painted her as being controlling of her mistress, a sort of dominant force in Florence's life, whether one just bangs on about how ugly she was, and that obviously if you're an ugly woman, you must be up to no good. So it's very difficult to understand with Mrs. Cox whether it was just a happy coincidence that Florence and Mrs. Cox came into each other's lives. They hit it off. They both needed something in life. Florence needed a social life, support, lack of judgment. Mrs. Cox needed money to support her family. But, and they hit it off and they were best buds, basically. Or whether she was this conniving, controlling woman. Some media reports her as being controlling of her mistress, and we know that Charles threatened to fire her. He'd threatened to fire her allegedly to save money, but whether it's because he didn't like the way she was able to influence his wife, it seems more likely to me. It's all very well firing some people, but his wife sure as hell isn't going to clean the house. He's married a wealthy heiress. She is not going to keep the house in the manner to which he's accustomed, frankly. And it makes no sense to me that he would fire the housekeeper. He's already fired the lady's maid. That's one thing. She's got the housekeeper. She's got the housemaid to double up, do more work. But to fire your housekeeper seems a bit silly. So I suspect that he maybe didn't like their relationship. Mrs. Cox made a lot of strange claims during the police interviews and inquests that she then goes back on, whether because she realised it implicated her as a murderer or because she wanted to implicate Florence as the murderer, we don't know. But she said that Charles had told her that he'd deliberately taken poison and that she wasn't to tell Florence. Mary Ann Keeber, the housemaid who was in the room at the time, denied having heard this. Mrs. Cox also said that she told the doctors it was a suicide attempt, though when interviewed, all the doctors denied having said this. So this all comes out the second inquest. The second inquest, it lasts 23 days, significantly longer than the first inquest, and the details are so scandalous that women and children are banned from the room while Florence Bravo testifies. Much like the newspapers, the focus seems to be more on the private lives of Charles and Florence rather than the murder. I don't know that they really discussed enemies. Obviously, in a death like this, the spouse is always the number one suspect. But there was a lot of discussion about their previous love lives. And the cross-examination of Florence launched the career of lawyer George Henry Lewis. Now, this inquest returns the verdict of willful murder, but again, no one is indicated as the perpetrator. There's no evidence of where the antimony had come from. We'll talk about that in a minute. There was some on the property, but there's no sort of definite, this is the tartar emetic. It was bought by so-and-so. These are the people who knew it was in the house. These are the people who had access to it. It just focused on the private and personal lives of Mr. and Mrs. Bravo. One paper said, in comment with almost the whole of the press, we protest against this way of conducting an inquest. During it, Florence would tell how her husband would basically force anal sex upon her. For some at the time, this was a form of contraception, but as we know, she had had 2 miscarriages. He had insisted on trying for another baby 3 weeks after the first miscarriage when she was still very ill. He wanted children. It seems more that this was a preference for him and a way to control and humiliate her. She was very upset about it. Now, this mystery is still unsolved today. Lots of people have tried to crack it. Who killed Charles Bravo? Was it his wife who'd realised she'd made a terrible mistake and was enduring anal rape daily? She'd separated from one husband, lost contact with her family and her friends, who had then started speaking to her again when she had remarried. Did she not want to risk another separation? So for her, it was more respectable to become a widow. Though we know from what happens after his death, she doesn't have a happy life. So leaving a husband who is drunk and abusive is one thing, but a wily, charming, clever lawyer is another. Even though everyone thought she should have stayed with her first husband, there will be people who understood why she couldn't, whereas leaving Charles would have made her seem at fault. Some theories say that she may have been trying to quell his libido by making him feel nauseous with the tartar emetic, and accidentally given him an overdose, which could make sense, especially if she was enduring sexual assault. Very often it would also show why she was quite as close to Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Cox would put her to bed. They would sit together until Florence was asleep, and maybe Florence felt safer with someone there, less like her husband was going to come in and make demands from her. Interestingly, Murderpedia have made their mind up. Florence Bravo is listed as a murderer on Murderpedia. And weirdly, there are a couple of murderers who aren't on Murderpedia that I'm surprised about. I don't think the Blackout Ripper is there, for example. So I'm intrigued. She's there. They think she did it. She's the most likely person. So I'd love to know what you think. Some believe it was Mrs. Cox herself. He'd threatened to sack her. Again, we talked about, was this a bid to save money, or was this to stop his wife having an ally? Did she do it because she felt sorry for her mistress? She'd introduced them. Did she feel responsible for Florence's suffering? Did she feel like he was a bad man? He was going to ruin her life. He was ruining Florence's life. They'd both be better off without him. Was it Dr. Gully who couldn't bear for his love to be married to someone else, or who wanted to save her from this dreadful marriage? We know that they would walk together occasionally. He would give her homeopathic remedies. He must have known that she was unhappy. He had given up his job. He'd become a social outcast. He'd lost everything for Florence. So to see her married must have been very difficult. To see her married unhappily probably worse. Agatha Christie, who referenced the Charles Bravo poisoning in a few of her books, believed that Gully was the only one clever enough to have committed the crime and got away with it. He would obviously have access to the tartar emetic if he wanted. But he wasn't in the house at the time. So I think at most he'd have been a sort of accessory getting the poison for Florence, perhaps. But it doesn't stand for me. And Agatha Christie longed to solve this case and she couldn't. George Griffiths is a big favourite with some people. He was a firm favourite in the media for a time. Now, he'd originally worked for Dr. Gully, and then when Dr. Gully had retired to live near Florence, he had started working for her, and he left to marry her lady's maid, Florence deeming it inappropriate to have a married coachman. And ladies' maids at the time, I believe, usually left service when they were married. But he's then re-employed in 1875 and lives with his wife in the Priory Lodge. It's quite strange that Florence would have him back. What happened to make her change her mind from, you must leave if you're going to get married, to come back and live on the property? Some suspect that it is blackmail on his part. He obviously, as I said, would have known a lot of what was going on with Florence and Dr. Gully, and whether he was using that to blackmail her, we don't know. That's just a thought. So Griffiths is the coachman who's sacked by Charles for dangerous driving. Now, he kept antimony in the stables to treat horses for worms and black spots. Did you know, my little side fact of the day, horses can't vomit? There you go. He had apparently said to the landlord of the nearby Bedford Hotel that Charles would not live long after his marriage, which is a very weird thing to say. Charles had no health issues. He was young. It's an odd thing to say. But George was working at Herne Hill when Charles died. He was not close. And said he'd got rid of the antimony when he'd left the Priory. But though whether that's true or not, we don't know. Some newspaper reports have him as an unreliable witness, but whether that's just because they don't like him because he was a coachman who got sacked, we don't know. But I think the thing he said to the landlord, saying to the landlord he's going to die not long after he gets married, is very interesting. What is worth noting is that after all of this, the household breaks up after the inquest. The twice-widowed Florence moves away to Southsea in Hampshire. Her family don't want to have anything to do with her. She is basically excluded from everything. And she dies at the age of 33 from alcohol poisoning just 2 years later in September 1878. Mrs. Cox, who had lived in Jamaica until her husband died, returned to Jamaica having inherited a nice amount of money from an aunt, I believe, who died, and then returns to England and dies in 1913. Dr. Gully dies in 1883. He remains excluded from society. What I find quite interesting is Florence will still have her money, and I would suspect in this situation for Dr. Gully and Mrs. Cox specifically to stay loyal and stay close to her, but they don't. I mean, Dr. Gully's given up everything for Florence. She's not been married that long, so it's only been 6 months to a year from them living down the road from each other and having an affair to the death of Charles and the inquests. Whether he couldn't bear for the fact that all their personal life had come out. I'm just surprised that having given it all up and being disgraced, it seems weird to not go the whole hog and just go together after this. And Mrs. Cox deserts, which isn't dessert, we don't know. Mrs. Cox goes back to Jamaica, which of course she has a right to do, but it just seems strange to me that these three don't stick together, or two of the three don't stick together. And Florence basically dies alone, as does Dr. Gully. And it's all a bit of a sad state of affairs. I would love to know who you think did it. I guess my money's on Florence. I mean, I don't know. But in cases where you don't know, quite often it means it's the spouse. And that is the story of the Balham Mystery, the poisoning of Charles Bravo. I hope you enjoyed it. I love hearing from you, so do send me an email, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can follow us on social media, where we're at The Monday Night Review. You can come and join Patreon, where you get mini-sodes, extra stories, and when I get my brain in gear, you will get first dibs on merch, and you will get discounts. So there you go. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.